Good evening. I'm so glad everyone has been enjoying themselves at their tables. There's nothing better than having to actually say that a few times in order to get people's attention, because it means people are having a good time. Takis, I just want to begin. Where are you? There you are. I just want to begin by saying thank you for being such an outstanding faculty director of the Albright Institute. It's almost 3 years, and there are going to be many celebrations, but I just want to start by really recognizing all of your really just outstanding contributions to the Institute. As a professor of computer science who's interested in how the web is changing the way we think, make decisions, and act as individuals and members of social communities, and who also has a lot to say about fake news. You have brought so much to the college, continue to bring, and you've brought so much to this very important role. So thank you for your leadership. And I just want to say thank you also to you, Rebecca, Beth, the rest of the staff, for the hard work and effort behind tonight's dinner, dialogue, and really for the entire winter session. It is just the work you do each and every year, it just continues to get better and better. So good evening, students, faculty, staff, returning alumni, and distinguished guests from around the country and from around the world. Welcome to Wellesley, and welcome to the Albright Institute's 2019 Public Dialogue, Challenges to Democracy. I just want to say a quick thank you to all of our Albright ambassadors, trustees, and former emerita trustees, our world-class roster of Albright faculty and presenters. We are so grateful for all you do to make the Albright Institute such a powerful demonstration of an interdisciplinary approach to solving global problems of academic rigor and leadership at Wellesley. And I just offer a very special thank you to Secretary Albright. I speak for the entire college when I say that our admiration and gratitude to you know absolutely no bounds. And we are so honored and elated to have you with us tonight. And I am still amazed that you took a red-eye from California and drove up here from New York. We are truly at a critical moment in our country, a time when long-standing democratic principles, institutions, and norms are under constant and intense threats. From professors, analysts, and policymakers across the political spectrum, we hear words like alarming, dangerous, and high stakes to describe the attacks on the Justice Department, national security, and our democracy more broadly. This concern extends to other democracies, as we all know, and we are so clear about the threat of Russia and beyond. Secretary Albright warns us in her most recent bestseller, Fascism: A Warning, of the history of fascism and how this history points to an ominous present in the United States. Professor Sunstein warns of the danger of systemic assaults on branches of government by the current administration in his book, Can It Happen Here? Authoritarianism in America. And Ambassador Power addressed the threat of Russia in her final speech to the UN in January of 2017. Well, our young people are critical as we renew our commitment and focus to the future, a democratic future. Our Albright Fellows will be the next generation of leaders. They are outstanding young women from around the globe. They are experiencing what it means to work in a collaborative and deeply thoughtful way, and how to consider and really face complex issues. They are our hope for the future. It was just on Monday when we celebrated the birthday of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And when I think of our Albright Fellows, and when I think of our Wellesley students, and when I think of young people across the country and across the world, I think of Coretta Scott King's I think it was really quite prescient statement. She said, "Freedom is never won. It's fought for in every generation." This year's Albright's Fellows and all of us are so fortunate to have such widely admired and accomplished leaders here tonight to share their wisdom. This year's dialogue brings together a group of truly renowned experts to help us think about the way forward. So it's a rare honor to introduce Ambassador Samantha Power. She is the Anna Lynn Professor of the Practice of Global Leadership and Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and the Professor of the Practice at Harvard Law School. She's also this year's Distinguished Visitor. After serving from 2009 to 2013 on the National Security Council as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights, she became the 28th and youngest ever U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and served as a member of President Obama's cabinet. In this role, she became the public face of U.S. opposition to Russian aggression in Ukraine and Syria, negotiated the toughest sanctions in a generation against North Korea, lobbied to secure the release of political prisoners, helped build new international law to cripple ISIL's financial networks, and supported President Obama's path-breaking actions to end the Ebola crisis. Forbes called her a powerful crusader for U.S. foreign policy as well as human rights and democracy. Before joining the U.S. government, Ambassador Power was the founding executive director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School, and it comes as no surprise that she has twice been named Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People on the list. The author of many significant books, the highly influential A Problem from Hell, America and the the Age of Genocide. I should say the end. We wish it was the end of genocide, right? Someday. Won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critic Circle Award. And I must say, it was a real thrill for me to have Ambassador Power sign my very well-worn copy of my book, which I cherish. She's currently completing a memoir, and it's entitled The Education of an Idealist. And I think it's a book that will so clearly and directly speak to young people, and it's due to be published next year. Ambassador Power lives in Concord, Massachusetts, with her husband, Cass Sunstein, who I'll be introducing in a moment, and their two young children, Declan and Rian. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Samantha Power. So I'm delighted to introduce renowned legal scholar Cass Sunstein. He is the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard University and the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. During the Obama administration, he was administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. In 2018, Professor Sunstein won Norway's Holberg Prize. The committee praised him for the work that has reshaped our understanding of the relationship between the modern regulatory state and constitutional law. They noted that he is by far the most cited legal scholar in the United States and probably the world. Professor Sunstein summed up his work as addressing, I quote, how to promote enduring constitutional ideals, freedom, dignity, quality, self-government, the rule of law, under contemporary circumstances, which include large bureaucracies that sometimes promote and sometimes threaten those ideals. He is the author of 48 books and hundreds of peer-reviewed journal articles in a variety of legal fields, including administrative law, constitutional law, environmental law, and labor and employment law. And I just want to share with you, I just had a wonderful short conversation with Professor Sunstein, and he's using his knowledge to also impact medicine and health, which is also quite remarkable. Throughout, he's thought deeply about the U.S., about U.S. democracy, the strength of our institutions, how American values underpin that strength, and the threat of authoritarianism. In March 2018, his acclaimed book, Can It Happen Here? Authoritarianism in America, was published. Please welcome Professor Sunstein. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, Wellesley class of 1959, is one of the leading figures of her generation. She was the first woman to become Secretary of State, the highest-ranking woman in the history of the U.S. government, when confirmed in that role in 1997. Her distinguished service to this country has cemented her reputation as a visionary, bold, and principled leader. Her most recent book, Fascism, A Warning, I think the name says it all, became a bestseller. She is the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, presented by President Obama in 2012. Secretary Albright is a globally renowned advocate for women, women's education, equality, and a beacon for women leaders, for that matter, for all leaders everywhere. She is also a dedicated Wellesley alumna whose legacy can be seen in 10 years of Albright Fellows who are already changing our world in so many positive ways. And perhaps one of the most powerful tributes I can share is how often our students name her as their role model and how time and time again they hope to follow in her footsteps. Welcome, Madam Secretary. And now I'm honored to introduce Wellesley Professor of Political Science, Stacey Goddard. At the start of the next academic year, as Professor Metaxas told you, Professor Goddess.
Yeah, you go.
And I didn't even have a glass of wine. Professor Goddard will become the Albright Institute's next faculty director, and I know that she will build on the success of the Institute's first 10 years to move us forward to new milestones. Her research focuses on issues of international security, with a focus on legitimacy, rising powers, and territorial conflict. In her teaching, she generally engages her students with questions about why wars occur, how wars are fought, and how war shapes and is shaped by the political process. Her brand new book, When Right Makes Might, Rising Powers and World Order, opens with some very critical questions. I'm going to have you read the book to hear what they are. Suffice it to say, Professor Goddard is truly an outstanding professor. We are so fortunate to have you, Stacey, as one of ours, and we are so honored to have you moderate the session tonight. Thank you.
I'm not sure if I can live up to my new title, but let me begin by saying I am so grateful and I'm so honored to be moderating this panel tonight. It's obviously a challenging topic. I want to congratulate Madam Secretary, Professor Sunstein, on their best-selling books. I'm deeply depressed that a book on fascism and authoritarianism are best-selling books in today's age. But there you go. Where I basically want to do in many ways is begin with a baseline question and then move about where we are. And see if we're all on the same page, and then move into discussions of how it is we got here with these challenges to democracy. What do we think the types of mechanisms are involved in sustaining this turn away from democracy? And then really, hopefully there are notes of optimism throughout, but really end with an idea of, well, what can be done to change it? Because hopefully this isn't the place that we stay. But to begin on the more bleak note, reading your book, Secretary Albright, you bring up the Economist Democracy Index, and it's not a pretty picture. In 2017, The Economist published their annual index, and they basically took 70 countries and downgraded them on the scale of democracy for measures ranging from anything from the strength of civil society, economic inequality, religious freedom. So that obviously is a depressing set of indicators. Taking what we know about where democracy is, where would you say the baseline is? Is this something that is an historically significant moment? I mean, obviously democracies have never been perfect, filled with social injustice and economic inequality. Nobody is saying that it's a perfect system. Why is this moment particularly trying?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here despite what you just said, and have an opportunity again to meet with the Albright Fellows and this great community, and delighted that you are taking over. It's going to be fantastic and really great, and I'm very pleased to be here with my very, very good friend, Ambassador Power, and her husband, Kaz. We have spent a lot of time together, and so I'm very grateful that you came to do this, and I've already heard rave reviews about your time with the fellows. Yeah, I do have to say, you're going to find this hard to believe, but there's a certain amount of competition among secretaries of state. And so I have a conversation with General Powell and Secretary Baker. I have an institute, they have an institute. I say mine's better, but anyway, it is. But just so you know, it never stops in terms of who does what. But let me just say the following thing is, I do think that we need to be clear about the fact that democracy is a very complicated form of government. It is one in which the people have to participate and understand. It is based on a social contract, which in fact people decided to give up some of their powers in order to be protected by the state. And the state is supposed to fulfill certain responsibilities in terms of building roads or providing education or health. And I do think that one of the reasons we are where we are is that at the moment I think the social contract is broken. And I hope we can actually talk about that, because it is at the basis of it. Also, I do think it is a particularly I know people always say, stop using the word complicated, but it is, because of changes in technology that have provided the opportunity for people to know everything about everything, even whether it's true or not, and the positive and negative sides to it. And I have believed that democracy is the best form of government, and one that does in fact respect the will of the people, but it takes an awful lot of work. And I think people have kind of not given it the amount of work and have taken it for granted. I was born in Czechoslovakia. I think most of you know that. And when we came here, and by the way, one of the reasons I wrote the book was that I have been a refugee twice. First, as a result of fascism by the Germans, and when World War II began, and second, I call communism fascist, also because the communists took over Czechoslovakia. I couldn't live there anymore, or my father couldn't. And we came to the United States, and I'll never forget my father saying the following: there is no greater life than to be a professor in a free country. But he also said that he was not sure Americans fully understood how fragile democracy is, and that Americans take democracy for granted. And that is something that I've grown up with, which is why I felt it important to really write about what is the problem, what this democracy index is telling us. And I have also seen the democracy index from a very vivid and practical side right now. I'm chairman of the board of an organization called the National Democratic Institute. It was started by Ronald Reagan. He spoke in London in 1983 and said democracies were not real good about explaining themselves vis-a-vis communism. And so he started the National Endowment for Democracy, which has 4 institutes in it: Democrats and Republicans, business and labor, the warp and woof of our country. I was the first vice chair of the National Democratic Institute, named democratically by fiat, and we had no idea what to do. And it is something that is going on now, and I think it has witnessed what you're talking about in terms of the democracy index, which is because democracy is hard and complicated, and because there are competitors for the title of how to run countries. At the moment, the Chinese and then also the Russians. So I think it's worth, I'm very glad we're doing this discussion to kind of unpack what I said. There are those who think my book is alarming. It's supposed to be. And I think that basically it is an attempt to look at the history of what has happened and try to help to answer that question.
Ambassador Power, when you were in President Obama's administration, this was obviously, arguably, more of a high point for the promotion of democracy and human rights. Did you, thinking about Professor Albright's comment about breaks in the social contract, were you seeing those tensions as you were in the administration? Was what is happening now already on the horizon?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Secretary Albright, for putting so much pressure on me that I had no choice but to accept the distinguished visitor opportunity. No, I know why she was a hell of a negotiator. Let me put it that way. A book deadline landing on my head, and here I am, talking about other things. It's been amazing. The students here are amazing. It's like graduate level, the kind of students that we teach at Harvard Kennedy School and Harvard Law School. It's incredible. To your question, we definitely saw this coming. Now, let me caveat that and then come back to it. The caveat is, on election night in the United States, Secretary Albright and I, thought we were going to have a celebratory bash with all the women ambassadors from the United Nations. There were then 37 women ambassadors out of 193 countries. They all gathered at my apartment, our apartment, I guess, at the
American government's apartment.
More our apartment probably than our apartment, at the Waldorf Astoria. And it wasn't just first woman Secretary of State, 37 women ambassadors, me, also Gloria Steinem. We decided that'd be a good idea because it was going to be just a great night, November 2016. But not only all that, we thought a documentary film crew, too. That was a good idea, just to capture the moment. So I didn't see that coming at all. But the indicators were all there. And so I think it's really important, as the Secretary has said, to see what we see in places like the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, the Philippines, Brazil, and the United States as basically, on the one hand, influencing each other a little bit. That's very hard to measure, to know how much events in other countries are influence the politics in those places. But certainly, things that were unthinkable 5 years ago, 10 years ago, are now not only thought but said. And things that were unsayable are not only said but done. So that changes the kind of normative culture, I think, in which any country's particular politics takes hold. But mainly, in each of those countries, the same set of dynamics, a sense that democracy has not delivered, that people, some segment of people, defined differently in each of the countries, but is being left behind, that internationalization, the multicultural, that opening up borders has been costly to things that were cherished, and that some of us perhaps were too quick to blow past and just think, well, it's progress. And sure, you'll have to retrain on a different set of tools or learn a different vocation, but in the end, everybody will be better off. Well, in the end is not where people live. They live in the moment, and they live, above all, I think, moved by questions regarding their dignity and a sense of whether they are being seen in our systems. And I think, as the Secretary has said, we lost sight of some of those who felt as if they were not being seen and that their interests were not being advanced. But there are other factors also. I got to serve in the Obama administration in the wake of a disastrous war in Iraq. And that war, it's easy to forget, was fought under the rubric of promoting democracy. I served in the Obama administration during what looked like an incredibly promising wave of democratization in the Arab world. Most of those efforts at democratization turned violent, and I think it's fair to say many, many people began to judge democracy according to how democracy was faring in newly violent places, which I think is unfair. I think the better way to look at it is, look what happens when you deny democracy for generations and then you don't do any kind of political evolution, political reform. If you don't do evolution, you're going to end up with revolution, and revolution turns violent. And so in fact, I think it's a lesson in what happens when you don't enfranchise people and you don't have democratic accountability and you allow a culture of corruption to flourish. But that became another exhibit, I think, in the litany of criticisms of democracy, and even things that felt like success stories, like the democratization in Myanmar or Burma, have themselves turned sour. And again, a set of dynamics, as some of the students yesterday talked about, a set of dynamics in Myanmar that have only a little bit to do with the greater political space that now exists there, and so much to do with anti-Muslim, anti-Rohingya animus, that gets lodged at the doorstep of democracy. And so the indicators were all there, but what you now have is something I think much worse, because it's a doom loop of a kind of narrative about democracy and its peril without sufficient attention to what Secretary Albright just talked about, which is what fascism is like, and what communism is actually like, and what living under a military dictatorship is like, and what it means to have corrupt officials and to never even be able to contemplate having an election to be able to get rid of them. That those memories, which people who come from the circumstances Secretary Albright came from, those people have those memories. But I think the worry is, if you look at polling for this, actually the generation that is so promising that's here at Wellesley, their appreciation, I think, for circumstances that we have seen recur in human history is not that great, and their understandable criticism of the democratic model in light of what we have before us is much more salient. And so I think now we have this competition between these models without the immediate memory of just how awful it is to live without rights.
So how pessimistic in many ways should we be in this moment, right? Because I think about kind of the historical trends of democracy, right? And they're not linear. We know that, right? So it's democratization oftentimes followed by a backslide, democratization followed by a backslide. And what you end up seeing, though, is oftentimes a tremendous spread of democracy. And Professor Sunstein, here I'm thinking about your recent book, because you said something in the first chapter that I found both disturbing and oddly comforting, which is that it is something along the lines of, it's bad now, but it's always been bad. And that in some ways this is the normal course of things. Do you see this as an exceptional moment, or do you think that perhaps some of the pessimism is overblown?
Okay, so one of my heroes is a psychologist named Amos Tversky, who said, I'm an optimist, and it's rational to be an optimist, because if you're a pessimist, you suffer twice. Once when the bad thing happens, and once when you think about it. So I think he's right. There's his great collaborator, Tversky's guy named Daniel Kahneman, who recently was asked some question that had the form of yours, and his response was, which I've made into a bumper sticker, by the way. I haven't put it in my car yet because of the snow. It is on Ambassador Power's car. She doesn't know that. He was asked a question. He said, it's not a matter of thinking. It's an empirical question. And I find that profoundly liberating, meaning that your mind can go in all sorts of directions. But if you think of it, optimism and pessimism, as an empirical question, then you're anchored on something which is answerable, and I'll get to that in a moment. The third quotation I used to like. I think it's really terrible. And it's Winston Churchill's statement that democracy is the least bad form of government. What a terrible statement. That statement stinks of monarchy, doesn't it? And I want to be very hard on Churchill here. It stinks of monarchy. Secretary Albright put it much better. She said democracy is the best form of government. And that is a distinctly democratic statement. it's more upbeat. Now, in terms of the awfulness of the moment, how pessimistic to be, crystal balls none of us has. And so a statement of pessimism or optimism is often not really a prediction, I think, but instead a statement of one's intensity of negativity toward President Trump, or toward China today, or toward Putin. So to turn it into an empirical predictive question is, I think, the right thing to do and very challenging to do. Let me talk around it a little bit. In terms of the arc of history, this is a fantastic time for democracy. Unbelievably fantastic in terms of the arc of history. I'm just back from a few days ago from the Netherlands, and to see democracy flourishing in the Netherlands in the way it is from the standpoint of human history, literally unbelievable. I'm also relatively recently back from Denmark, where the same could be said. The commitment to principles of self-government, human dignity, and equality in Denmark is historically through the roof. And this is Netherlands, and the Netherlands and Denmark. One could say the same about countless countries, meaning dozens. Sweden is certainly one, Canada another, and yes, absolutely the United States of America is another. So there's that. In terms of the probability that things are going to get really sour, if that's the question, the best empirical work we have is from Daniel Treisman, a quantitative social scientist, who says that if you look at the measures of what makes democracies actually fall not to less democratic, but to fascism, the United States, there's never been a country that's fallen from where the United States now is to, or even close to, fascism. And the two leading indicators, as I recall, are economic situation and longevity of democracy. So for the United States and other democracies, falling, I think, is not at risk. In terms of, let's say, democratic principles that involve freedom of speech, freedom of the press, let's say a recognition of the dignity of all persons, there are extremely serious challenges. I think the way forward in thinking about how to meet those challenges, or even how to think about them, is to identify a concrete hypothesis. If we're asking empirically, like things are getting worse for disabled people. Is that true? Basically, that's not true. The opposite is true in most democracies. The question is, are citizens losing faith in democratic processes? I think the empirically correct answer to that is yes. The view there, that's what consequences that has for actual practice is extremely unclear, I think. And those views are themselves highly labile, meaning they are shifting very dramatically, and they could turn on a dime. So I don't know how to think about that exactly. In terms of pessimism, I say just for myself, I'm not within 100,000 miles of pessimism. I'm not within 1 million miles of pessimism, but extremely serious concern about things that are happening in Germany, in France, in the United States, not Canada, not the Netherlands, not Norway, but that's very significant. To concretize what the locus of the concern is, I think is the way forward. So if the locus of concern is that sex equality is under great pressure, that would be a very good thing to discuss. If the locus of concern is voter suppression, that's an extremely concrete and real and present danger. So to think about those things. Are checks and balances under pressure? I don't think more than they were 10 years ago, not checks and balances. The voting system, absolutely. Russian interference, the fact that the President of the United States is, whether you like his policies or not, in some of his rhetoric, both now and in the campaign, looks exactly like Russia's advertisements trying to disrupt. Look, you can't distinguish between them. They're exactly the same. And that shows that's a threat to our capacity to treat one another with more than respect, I think, with a kind of a bow is how we should treat one another, of deference to fellow humanity. That's under pressure in this country.
So as a social scientist, I'm happy to heed your call to turn to the empirical away from the subjective. And I think there's a lot to unpack here, because as we were talking about baselines, we were also obviously talking about the causes of this. And I think a lot of them are interwoven, and I want to kind of try to pick them apart. One of them that came up in a few of your comments is economic inequality, right? Both domestically, but also globally. A lot of the moves toward democratization, I'm thinking particularly in Eastern and Central Europe during the 1990s, were also met with the dismantling of social safety nets. And now we are clearly in a position where there are a fair amount of people who feel that while democracy might be nice, they would also like to be able to eat and have other forms of social stability. So in what ways is economic inequality fueling some of this push against democracy? And are there mechanisms to begin to address that within the current system?
Well, I do think that inequality is fueling this, is that one of the things that is true, we all know everything about everything everywhere. And so when we see economic inequality in our own country and other places, there's no question, it is blamed on two things. One is technology, which I do think we did not fully explore or understand the unintended consequences of technology. It is, in so many ways, a gift to so many people. I always love to talk about the mega trend of technology, which has, for instance, helped. I like to talk about the woman farmer in Kenya who no longer has to walk miles to pay her bills because she can do it over her phone, and it allows her to have a life with her family or an education or even start a business. But technology has taken away jobs from other people. I also do think, as Kazi was saying, there are facts people are not aware of. There's less poverty in the world today than ever before, and yet we clearly talk about poverty in a variety of places. But I do think that there is economic inequality, and especially where we talk about the fact that we shouldn't have it. Why does that happen? Why are some people rich and some poor? And so I think that that is the basis of it, and especially if you go back to the social contract thing that I was raising.
Could you say more about the social, and I want to open this up to everybody here, because that seems to be so much a core of what you're saying here, that somehow the social contract that stands at the core of democracy is broken. What do you all mean by that?
Well, I do think, and this obviously goes back to all the political philosophy courses we took, is that basically people, the question is whether you believe that people have natural rights that they give up, or whether they are rights that are inherited from a monarch. But I think mostly those of us believe that people have natural rights, and in fact they are then given up in order to be able to live in a civilized society. Taxes are the price of living in a civilized society, and they are needed for a variety of projects, and when that doesn't happen, then people question why do they pay taxes, especially if some people believe that they shouldn't pay taxes at all. So I think that raises a question. You were talking about Central and Eastern Europe, and I find it a very, for obvious reasons, an interesting aspect of countries to look at. Again, I'm very proud to have been born in Czechoslovakia. It is a country that was a democracy in the interwar period. And just parenthetically, I have to say this, the first president of Czechoslovakia married an American woman. He married her in the last quarter of the 19th century, and he did something totally unheard of. He took her middle name, her maiden name as his middle name, which is quite stunning. He married a woman called Charlotte Gehrig, and his name was Thomas Gehrig Masaryk. The Czechoslovak Constitution was modeled on the American one, with one major exception. It had equal rights language in it in 1918. So kind of the thought was, why couldn't this particular country actually be a democracy after the end of World War II? And what happened was that they elected a government which had a communist majority in it. It was elected. And then there was the issue of the end of the Cold War and the fall of the wall. And Czechoslovakia had this incredible president, Václav Havel, who was a great moral leader. And so people thought it would work. And the question is why it didn't. And I think partially because a lot of the people that had lived under communism did have a secure life. And the question is, what is it that people really want? And I think this is something we need to talk about. There are whole groups of people that believe in free speech is the most important thing. I happen to believe that. But the bottom line is there are those who wanted some of the security that they'd had under communism. And then you talked about this, Samantha, is the corruption. I think that it adds to the inequality if there's some people that were able to make zillions by when public property was privatized, of stealing it in many different ways. So there are various aspects where we haven't thought through enough what the social contract, which is in fact supposed to provide a decent life if people give up some of their privileges, that was not happening as a result of a bunch of forces.
I just add a couple quick points. I mean, I think that what is really legitimate, right, is when people, I mean, we speak in terms of empirics, in terms of policy, in terms of people being left behind. You talked about, you know, sort of the incommensurability among the different rights, the right to choose your leader, to get rid of a leader who's corrupt, at the same time, the right to have a full stomach and be able to feed your kids. This is all well and good. But what we have associated with this noticing, right, new, relatively belated noticing of the number of people who have felt that the new democratic wave has left them behind, is not merely an attention to the policies, whether those associated with open borders or those associated with insufficient health care or doing away with the social net. Not merely, it'd be one thing if we were having this conversation, it's like, oh, there's a group of people who've come along and they have noticed that there are people who've been left behind, and they have a whole policy platform aimed at filling those gaps and making those people who feel unseen relevant again in the policy process. That's not what's happening. Let's be clear, right? So there's a set of individuals, and again, it varies in every country, and it's a heterogeneous group in every single circumstance, of course. But what you have are leaders who see that, in so far at least, talk a good game, and then look to blame a set of individuals, often with no empiricism at the heart of who they're blaming. I mean, if you look at, for example, the effort to blame an imagined migrant crisis, you know, to blame joblessness or a lack of health care, not on the fact that your party is opposed to actually providing universal health care, but blaming the lack of health care or the inability to get treatment on a bunch of imagined people who, in an imaginary world, you know, want to storm the border and you know, take over your school system and your hospitals and everything else. So I think it's important for us to stick to empiricism, to look to what those issues were that we were insufficiently attentive to, while also calling out the phoniness of the remedy being offered by those who have exploited this sense of invisibility.
There are lots of fantastic issues here, so let me have some questions and speculations. My political hero, I'll confess, is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Roosevelt proposed, as a culmination of two wars he successfully helped win, one, the Depression War, the war against economic collapse, and World War II. And he called for a second Bill of Rights, which entailed a right to education, a right to protection against economic distress if you're disabled, a right to protection against monopolies, a right to help if you are old and can't protect yourself, basically a right against acute deprivation. Roosevelt was not concerned deeply about economic inequality as such, and I'm with him. That is the problem, in my view, is that many of our brothers and sisters are facing, in the United States, in country Mexico, all over the world, terrible economic conditions. Let's call that the second Bill of Rights problem. If you have a society where half of the people are making $500,000 a year and half are making $2 million a year, that's profound inequality, but that's great. If you have a society where everyone's making $7 a year, that's really equal, and it's horrible. So normatively, I would want to put a spotlight not on the top 1%, but on the bottom 10%. Now, to tax hard the top 1%, hooray for that, because then the resources can go to projects or people who need them more. But I'm not going to stand in applause for that. I would stand in applause to helping the people at the bottom 10%. And notice this is a project against deprivation, not a project against inequality as such. So that's one kind of set of normative thoughts. On the empirical side, what I'm puzzling over is a hypothesis, which is that democracy is under greater threat under conditions of extreme inequality. I just don't know if that's true. It might be true, but I don't know that it's true. Certainly, many democracies sustain themselves for long periods of time when there's a great deal of inequality. They may be deeply unjust, but they aren't collapsing. So I'm just puzzling over this. I have a speculation, again, very tentative, because this isn't something on which I have data. But the speculation is a principal driver of threats to democracy right now, which is segregatable from the inequality issue, I think, is about identity and culture and not about money, where the threats to democracy come from people not necessarily who are economically suffering or who are saying, oh my God, Steve Jobs, awful. That's not what they're saying. What they're saying is, my nation is being taken away from me by them. And this we see in France to some extent, in Germany, in the United States, in Italy, in all nations where democracy is under siege. And I think that to a greater or lesser extent, I hope in all of those to a lesser extent, I think Ambassador Power, as I call her in our most intimate moments, her comment about listening to people who are feeling somewhere between despair and outrage and what is to be offered to them, that's extremely important. It is not only to offer them an economic ladder. A lot of them, they have an economic ladder. It's a low rung, but what's outraging them is not, I'm speculating, so much the lowness of the rung. They're on the ladder, but that their country is taken away from them. What do we have to say to them? Just one little note, some of the most provocative work in political theory in the last 50 years, I think, talks about the moral foundations of people's beliefs. And what it finds is that liberals have 2 moral foundations, and conservatives have 5. Liberals think about harm, and they think about fairness. So if someone's smacked in the face, liberals are upset. If someone is treated unfairly, liberals are upset. Conservatives are also upset about those things. They understand them somewhat differently, but not a lot differently. Harm and fairness are shared as moral values. But conservatives think about 3 things that liberals don't. One is authority, another is purity, and a third is what?
Loyalty?
That was a test for Ambassador Power, is loyalty. So authority, purity, and loyalty. And when it turns out that Democrats don't speak about loyalty or don't speak about the legitimacy of authority, then they are leaving about half of their fellow citizens in the dust, and they are feeling morally unheard. Of the politicians in recent years who spoke about those 3 moral foundations most, in the last 4 or 5 presidential campaigns, guess who did the very best? Number one of all the candidates.
The Democratic candidates?
Either. Guess who did the very best, Democratic or Republican? Who did best on the 3 conservative moral foundations? President Trump. Spectacular success. Of the Democrats, who did pretty well? Barack Obama. Who did catastrophically badly? Secretary Clinton. She didn't speak in terms of those values. Now, in my view, those values, at least in certain forms, should be honored. Loyalty to one's country, thinking of our military as heroes, and not being ashamed of thinking of that. Thinking of our elders with respect, thinking of our traditions as something to value, that's not something to be sniffed at. And that is something which a lot of people in Germany and France and the United States all believe. Purity means the sacred. It can be a religious conviction.
And it can mean other things.
Or it can mean the environment. It can also mean homophobia.
And no Muslims
It-
and
it has-
other dimensions.
Well,
Yeah.
so the specification is contested, but to speak in a way that resonates with people's values, that's what a participant in democratic processes should do. My unsupported speculation is that the moral foundations idea and the identity cultural disparity gives us more purchase on threats to democracy than economic inequality. But I want to be tentative about that. It's an empirical question. It's not about what I think.
I actually believe, if we're going to be formal, Dr. Sunstein, that in fact it's a combination. And if I went back at looking at the history of fascism, by looking at Mussolini and Hitler, they came out of a time when there was economic inequality, whether because of bad government in Italy or the Depression or the Weimar Republic in Germany. But then what happened, it got linked with the nationalist aspect, which is a leader who identifies himself with a tribal group that has not been respected for its identity, but the basis has been that economic inequality. And then that group does not want the minority to have any power at all. So I think it's based in this economic inequality and then absorbs the nationalist argument, which is very strong. Nationalism is a very strong sense about identity, and I think that's what happens, which then leads to fascism, because it is the majority rule of those against the democracy is majority rule and minority rights. But what happens in the transmission of all of this, the minority rights not only go away, but they are to blame for the economic inequality because they are the scapegoats and also because they are the other. So I think it's hard to separate the economic from the national.
Let me build off this, and one thing, we'll be wrapping up this in about 10 minutes and asking people to come to the mic with their own questions, so definitely be preparing to do that. So this is most likely the final question I'll have. But so this is obviously really complicated, and one thing I appreciate about everything you've said here is none of you are reducing democracy to something simple. Right? This is not simply elections, or perhaps we need a better media, right? That always seems very instrumental. And what you're actually saying are, what are the foundations of building national political communities that are in line with democratic, small d, democratic principles, right? So in other words, authoritarians or authoritarian-like leaders have been very good and very adept at taking things like immigration as a threat and mobilizing populations against them. What many of you are saying is you need to recognize the need for people to be involved and feel like they're participating in a national community. How can you do that, and can you do it, but remain true to democratic principles, that is to say, of inclusivity, right, of free speech, of not turning somebody else into some sort of threatening other? Because that seems to be what you're proposing. Is that something possible, or is there always this type of bounded threat out there?
Well, I think that part of it, and to go back to FDR, you have nothing to fear but fear itself. And what has happened is all of a sudden fear is used as the way to mobilize people, either to participate in some way by pointing out the other. And fear becomes a motivating factor instead of kind of looking for solutions that involve people. One of the aspects in terms of the motivating factor goes back to my social contract. The bottom line is citizens have an obligation. It is a privilege to vote and to participate, but it is also an obligation. And that part doesn't seem to have come through enough at the moment. It's mostly complaining rather than thinking about what our responsibilities are in terms of community.
Although we've just come out of, in this country, the greatest voter mobilization for a midterm election, in a couple generations at least, and the greatest activation particularly of women and of many, many young women. We haven't seen anything like this. So as I was talking to President Johnson about this yesterday, there's a kind of conflict, I think, going on in people's minds in many democracies. On the one hand, a sort of despair and despondency and concern, that the system, the model as a whole is failing people, that it can't deliver, that we have a Congress that's much more dysfunctional than the do-nothing Congress back of Harry Truman in 1948 or whenever it was. That on the one hand, and then, the Parkland students, the Wellesley students, the firsts that we've experienced all over the country of people who never dreamed of getting into politics, but kind of looked around and said, well, if this is, Donald Trump can be president, surely I can run for the school board or run for Congress. And so this activation, I think, in many ways, if you really started to see people taking greater ownership of the democracy and not leaving it to politicians, indeed replacing those politicians, I think that's ultimately where you're going to see democracy delivering, when you have more individuals who are part of the system, who come from having raised families, having struggled to make ends meet, not professional politicians who've just been in Washington the whole time. I really think that change in the complexion, no pun intended, but of the House, if they were, in the majority in both houses, I think you'd actually start to see a much more attuned set of representatives who are more grounded, in their communities, which I think has been lost in Brussels, has been lost in this country. But that said, for all of the despair about democracy, I do think, and I talked about this with the students the last couple days, we know the warts of our system. We are living them every day. The inability to pass a budget, a crazy, unprecedented government shutdown that has our federal workers, our public servants, having to go to soup kitchens, basically, to be able to sustain themselves in this period. I mean, if you needed a monument to what's wrong with democracy, this is the moment. Forget the election of Donald Trump. We are living the gridlock and the sense that it's not working. But on the other hand, just because we have elected individuals who are not coming together in order to put country first, that's not democracy's fault, right? That's a reminder to us about who we need to put into these jobs. That shouldn't be cause to say, oh, and therefore, an enlightened dictator would be much better, right? Which you actually see people doing when confronting circumstances like this. That's why the polling among young people in particular is so chilling to me, to see this disillusion with democracy, which we've been talking about it, but then this romantic idea of what autocrats and populist authoritarians can do. Are they going to deliver for the people, whether it's economic inequality, economic hardship, or a sense of the blighting of people's and the neglect of people's identity? Are the autocrats going to deliver for those individuals? Are they going to help a struggling, not the bottom 10%, but the struggling middle class in this country? Is that going to work? No. But right now we're in a moment where grass is always greener, and we know the warts of our current system. And so there's some notion that there's a strong man in a lot of cultures, not just this one, but that there's some populist authoritarian answer to what has to lie just in actually us mobilizing and putting people in power who are looking out for the interests of their constituents.
So in the history of the world, no nation with a free press and with democratic elections has ever experienced a famine. That's bizarre. But it's true. How can it be that a nation with democratic elections and a free press has never experienced a famine? The reason is, if you have a free press and democratic elections, the officials' jobs depend on famine prevention. And a famine occurs because of food scarcity, which is a product not only of there's not a lot of stuff to eat, but also policies that ensure a period in which people can't eat. Now, if you remember anything from my remarks at least, and I hope you'll remember Secretary Albright and Ambassador Power rather than mine, but if you remember anything from mine, please let it be, please let it be this, that no democracy has ever experienced a famine. And that's not only a factoid, it's also a metaphor for the extent to which democracies deliver. You know Karl Malone, the great basketball player?
They don't. They're really
You don't?
young. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a basketball player named the Mailman. He delivers. Democracy is the mailman. It delivers. The government may be shut down, but it isn't the case that there's mass starvation in this country. The government may be shut down, but if you compare what it's like in Moscow at this moment to what it's like in New York City, it's a different world. If you look objectively at indicators of human well-being, either how much are people liking their lives, democracies are high up, fascist or authoritarian systems are low down.
When people feel they can answer the question without getting arrested.
It's not an accident that democracies deliver for people. Not enough, not close to enough, but they're the best, as the Secretary said. But I even think that doesn't get the heart of it. That's about consequences and delivery. The beating heart of democracy, which I think everyone in some part of their mind knows, was born in somewhere between 1720 and 1750, 15 miles away from here in Concord, Massachusetts, when a notion of the equal dignity of human beings moved like electricity through towns. This wasn't the only place where it happened, but in Concord, Massachusetts, it happened. The idea that you would doff your cap to someone who had more money than you, or look down, not look them in the eye because they had blood that was better than yours, people started thinking, no, not out of hating the people who were wealthier, who had better blood, but of thinking we're all equal here. And when shots were fired, the real shot heard around the world on April 19, 1775, those were shots for democracy, and they weren't fundamentally about consequences, as important as they are, if they were about the equal dignity of human beings. And since everyone, whether they live in Beijing or the most authoritarian nation on the face of the earth, everyone has a part of their mind that recognizes the plea for equal dignity.
I do want to open up the floor now to any questions. I know there is a microphone over there. Is there also, or is this going to the center?
It's moving.
So do please come up if you have questions.
Hello. Thank you very much for sharing your perspectives. They knew I was coming up, that's why they're laughing. And I overate, so I'm feeling slightly uneasy. But thank you so much. It's really an honor to be able to ask a question directly to you all. And you have so much experience and knowledge backing up your perspectives. I think for me, something really that came up and then made itself so evident to me since yesterday was that people really are feeling left out, and then that's why we're seeing there's so much divide across the world. If you look at Rohingya crisis, it's really that they're trying to kick out this other group that they don't identify with. I'm from Kashmir, and that helps you understand a bit of my perspective, I guess. So I just want to know, do you think we have all become unboiled eggs the moment we take any criticism? We sort of start cracking up. The one day will quote me on that. But sorry, I'm rambling too much. But what I'm really trying to ask is that do you think that we're speaking about democracy and its values so eloquently that there is a group that is feeling left out and that they can't see value in democracy?
So how do we articulate this in many ways to the people who do feel the most in need?
I think you've raised a very important point because, in a room like this, we can have very elaborate discussions. And I think the question is, what do people get out of it? And I think that democracy has to deliver. That is part of the problem. And some of it does have to do with economic aspects. I think one of the things I've often talked about is in college, one spends time talking about what comes first, political development or economic development. They go together because people want to vote and eat. And so the bottom line is, how can people that have been elected explain better what the... By the way, I never can think of the right adjective to go with average people, ordinary. Just whatever adjective one uses is already kind of deprecatory in some way. The largest number of people need to understand what they get out of it. And part of the thing, and it has something to do with some of the things you said, I have my to-do list. That we all know the saying, see something, say something. I have added to that, do something. And the do something does have to do with the either running for office or supporting those that want to do it. And then something that is even harder, which is talking to people with whom you disagree. Right. I was saying at dinner, I don't like the word tolerance because that's tolerate, put up with. I think it has to be respect and to try to understand what is it that is motivating and what is missing. And I think that we need to explain what are the products of democracy and that they might be slow in coming. And that's the hardest part because people are impatient. They go to the polls and they vote and then think tomorrow everything will be all right. And it is that part that takes so long, and it requires respect for them and also to try to actually make sure that they can eat and have a living. But it is hard. I think we make a mistake if we think it's a magic answer quickly. It is not. So.
Thank you.
Good evening, Secretary Albright, Ambassador Power, Dr. Sunstein, and of course, Professor Goddard. My name is Emma, and I'm a senior. And my question is, during these conversations, you've talked a great deal about divisions between authoritarianism, democracy, people who are benefiting the 1%, people who are suffering from inequality, and in the United States, Democrats and Republicans. And I was wondering if you could possibly share a quick anecdote or story about a time that you've had a bipartisanship that's worked and what you feel was crucial in allowing for that to get done.
I have a good one, I think. So when I was in the government, we had a very important environmental regulation involving clean air, and a very expensive regulation. And the environmentalists in Washington and the country loved it. The corporate-oriented people, or we can call them the economic growth-oriented people, hated it. And the polarization was extremely intense. And I was overseeing the regulation. We got from the democratic process comments from all sides, and if people said, hooray for you, or you should be locked up, that wasn't very helpful. But if they said, this is really good, it's going to have these public health consequences, maybe it came from a professor here, maybe it came from an expert in air pollution, super helpful. Or if some person with an economic background, I'm looking at you, economics major, said, there's a way you can do this that's much less costly, helpful. It turns out we got from I was in the Obama administration, a long time ago, but you remember that? Democrats, you remember that? From a very prominent Republican, I won't mention him, but in Congress, who hated Obama. He sent me 12 comments saying, your rule is awful for 12 reasons. The rules cost was, I'm going to make up the number, but this is roughly right. As proposed, it was an $11 billion rule. That's very expensive. It came in at about $9 billion, so we cut a lot of the cost off because of his excellent ideas. So I called him up. It's the only time I did this. On the day the rule was announced, per Secretary Albright's suggestion, talk to someone who disagrees with you. And I said, you know, you had 12 ideas, 7 of them we actually thought were good, and we did them exactly as you said. 5 of them we thought were not so good, and we either didn't do them, and here's why, or we did them just a little bit. And we had a little conversation about the substance. He was a smart guy, he was on top of the details, and he said, that sounds great. You did the right thing. I'm going to issue a public statement of support for what you've done. Now, to have one of President Obama's fiercest Republican critics support one of his most controversial actions in the domestic arena, that was, you couldn't even dream of something so amazing. He never issued the statement.
Staff.
I think the reason was he got back and he said, I like it, I'm going to issue a statement. His staff said, are you kidding? You're going to lose your reelection. But he didn't issue a negative word. To this date, he has not said a negative word about that. And that was a very important signal that we had learned from him. And he had learned a bit from us. And the result was, across extremely sharp political lines, once we put all the values really to one side and started asking concrete questions, what are you getting for this cost? There really was maybe an inch and a half between us. That's not a lot.
Thank you so much.
My name is Rosalind. I'm a senior majoring in economics and political science, and I am also a pre-law student. I'm from China. So I have a question about international human rights that stems from a personal observation. In my opinion, despite the development of international law, nation states remain the main role player in international politics, and the principle of sovereignty and non-interference remain to be a norm, a very strong one. And oftentimes governments violate human rights without being punished under the framework of international human rights law, and most of the pushback come from independent national governments. So it seems to me that within the domain of international human rights, one can make much more impact by working inside of a national government than working, say, as an international human rights lawyer. So I would like to ask if you think this is the case, if this will continue to be the case going into the future, and if you have any advice for students who are interested in international human rights, who are considering going to law school, and I believe there are quite a few of us here among the fellows. So I'd like to see if you have any advice for what options we have going into this domain. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Maybe I'll take that question. And I hope however many of you there are who want to go into international human rights, that there are more today at the end of the day than there were yesterday morning before I showed up on campus, or else I have failed miserably to inspire you to go into this field. You really put your finger on an essential reality, an essential tension. So just to step back, the Second World War happens. You see the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany and in Mussolini's Italy and beyond. And there's a recognition among statesmen in the wake of that carnage, and in the wake of the Holocaust in particular, that if you leave it up to states to just do what they want within their borders, you could have outcomes like that which we saw, the destruction and the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews, of 11 million people, just within Hitler's jurisdiction alone. There was also a recognition, not everywhere, but a recognition that also the practices that governments undertook within their own borders, and this is a point that Secretary Albright has made often, is actually a decent predictor, not a perfect predictor, but of how they are likely to behave regionally and internationally. So there are multiple reasons to really care about what goes on inside a state, notwithstanding also the bedrock international principle from the Treaty of Westphalia to the present and actually well before that, but that also borders matter, and you don't want states trampling some other state's borders, simply saying, oh, we care about what's going on inside. So this dualism between recognizing that human rights matter intrinsically, recognizing that states left to their own devices will do terrible things within their borders, and recognizing that if you aren't curious about what's going on inside a border, you're likely to be blindsided also in terms of larger regional and international stability. All of those are at the center of the international legal architecture that gets built in the wake of the Second World War. But they live alongside sovereignty and non-interference. And so the UN Charter, and Secretary Albright and I grappled with this on very different crises at very different times, but this tension between a state's desire to be left alone and not bothered by anybody, and then these principles which grow out of hard-earned experience and bloodshed, that tension is the tension that China and the United States battle over day in, day out at the United Nations. It's the tension that international human rights lawyers of the kind that you might be considering becoming, that they are dealing with, because every time they raise something that's happening within a state and the deviance of a state from the international standard, they're told, hey, that's our business. Certainly that's what the United States generally says under Democrats and especially Republicans, but not only Republicans. So your question is, amid all that, so what's the right way to make a difference? I think the answer is, where your taste takes you. I think it's incredibly important that we have organizations like the International Committee for the Red Cross that are, for example, the enforcers and the monitors, the observers of the Geneva Conventions, looking at when states are deviating from the Geneva Conventions, being a kind of intergovernmental arbiter of who is in compliance and who is deviating, and calling that out. In the case of ICRC, for good or bad, they do it privately with states. It's a longer conversation about whether that should give way, and sometimes it should be public. But regardless, that's a role that they perform. They're international human rights, international humanitarian law lawyers, and their loyalty is to the Geneva Conventions, I think you'd say, and to the larger principles of international law. Lawyers at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which Secretary Albright helped create and shepherd into existence, they were not citizens of Bosnia or of Serbia or of Croatia, but they were looking at the Genocide Convention and the standards on crimes against humanity, and they were looking into a country that was deviating from them and saying, you can't do that. And this tribunal came into existence, and it indicted 75 people, including the people responsible for the largest massacres in Europe in 50 years. And those people were arrested, and they were prosecuted, and they were jailed not in their home countries, where they could never have been jailed, but in a distant tribunal, which has all kinds of downsides, because that means the publics were not engaging in what was happening in the courts in the way that they would have been if it was local, but it never would have happened if you had relied on it being locally. So those are some examples of international law having force, and international human rights and humanitarian law having force. But that said, the best, I think you're right, in the long term, the most sustainable model is for those standards to exist and for citizens to be moved by those standards, and for politicians within countries to say, hey, we shouldn't be supporting the Saudi coalition in Yemen. They're starving children. They're killing wedding parties and firing on funerals. So Republican and Democratic members of Congress here in this country, out of intuition or out of actually observing what those international standards are or what our own domestic standards would be, should say enough. And that work should come within a national political system. But there's a lot of work to go around. There's so much work to be done that I think it really depends on where you feel like you can make the greatest difference. And it really depends also on the country and the extent to which those standards even matter in a political culture, which in some countries which are so focused on sovereignty, those standards feel very removed.
I just want to briefly add to that, because one of the interesting aspects is one could say, I wouldn't, but one could say that we didn't know what was happening during World War II. We now know everything that's going on inside boundaries. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and plus the various judicial groups that have been created, including the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Court, have shown an advance in all this. And I do think that it's important to keep pursuing it. And one example of something I have to say is, first of all, it's very interesting to kind of think about relationships that people have while in office. I happen to believe that we need to do something about Kosovo on ethnic cleansing. The Secretary of State can say whatever, but has no airplanes. So part of it was that I had to persuade the Pentagon that we were going to do something about it. The Pentagon disagreed with me. President Clinton agreed with me. But what is interesting, when we all got out of office, there was the formation of a task force created by the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Holocaust Museum, and they asked Secretary Cohen, who had been Secretary of Defense, and me to run it. He admitted, he said I was right and he was wrong, which I think was a very interesting thing for him to say. But the fascinating thing is we came up with an idea that there need to be some early warning system. And we recommended that something called the Atrocities Prevention Board be created. It is the only task force I've ever been on in which President Obama, then there was a presidential decision about it. He created it, and before she was ambassador, headed it. And it's a very interesting example that if you really get people together and push, and you have a president who actually understands the issue, it is important to get something done. And so it does happen, and it is a growth industry, believe me. You need to be part of that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your answers.
So I think this is a conversation that could clearly go on all night, but being mindful of the time and the fact that I hear that people like to do things like sleep, we should probably wrap it up. I was asked to say a few closing comments. Before I do, I want to thank all of you, Secretary Albright, Ambassador Power, Professor Sunstein. This conversation in many ways was at a level that I guess should be expected given all of your experience. But the way in which you identified the challenges to democracy and didn't simplify them and talked about the various room that we might have for hope was really, truly inspiring. I want to thank all of you. I want to thank all of you here, particularly President Johnson and the entirety of Wellesley College for the support of the Albright Institute, for all of your support of the Albright Institute. Takis, thank you so much for all the work that you did, and thank you to all of the fellows. I guess in closing, I just wanted to say one thing, which is I was trying to think about this in terms of the message of hope and building a bit off of what you had said, Secretary Albright, which is the question of what it is that we can do, right? See something, say something, and do something. And one thing that I hope that we think about is what we can also do not only as individuals, but as a Wellesley community. The types of challenges that you've described here are so very daunting, and they are global. And I think sometimes it is hard to think about what it is that institutions that are relatively smaller in scope as compared to global challenges can do. And one thing that I've been extraordinarily proud of as a faculty member at Wellesley College is the ways I actually think that this institution is invested in giving our students and all of the members of our community what I think are critical weapons in fights against authoritarianism. Authoritarianism, I think, oftentimes thrives on cynicism, and it thrives on building feelings of helplessness. It thrives on telling us that there are no principles to adhere to, that there are no institutions worth fighting for. And it thrives on telling you that you don't have the power to do anything, and thus you must turn to other strong-minded individuals to have it be done for you. And I think that at Wellesley College in general and at the Albright Institute, we embrace the idea that cynicism has no place. We can be skeptical and we can be critics, but we're always using that to build something out of these types of institutions. And one thing I certainly know about Wellesley students in general, and certainly the Albright Fellows, is that feelings of helplessness have no place here. So hopefully with all of these conversations, we can do precisely what all of you said, which is not simply be complacent in democracy, but think about something that this is something that we can fight for, to not let the institutions save us, but hopefully go ahead and save the institutions. So,
Can I close with a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt
Absolutely.
before the president leads us?
please do.
This is my favorite Eleanor quote. You all know it, I'm sure, because it must be like Wellesley's theme song. A woman is like a tea bag. You don't know how strong she is until you put her in hot water. You go, girls.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.